Hello everybody, I'm hoping you can all hear me there okay, yeah? Perfect, great, thank you. Just hello to everybody, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. If I put on my video now, that might help a little bit. Hello there. This webinar is being run as part of the 12 Apps of Christmas project, which was launched on December 1st and is going to run until December the 16th. And we have people joining us here today on this webinar from Ireland, the UK, America, even Australia and Sweden. So you're either up very late, you're up very early, or you're missing your lunch. So thanks for that, and it's lovely to have you here with us today. Before I move on and introduce our speaker today, I just have a couple of very quick kind of housekeeping type notices that I just want to give you. Firstly, the webinar is being recorded, and thanks to John for agreeing to that, and we'll make a link available on the 12 Apps website in the coming days once I have the actual recording. And secondly, because there are so many of you, there was 166 people who registered to take part today, so because it's such a large group, we've decided to leave the mic to just John alone and the video as well. So if you have any comments to make, resources, links, whatever, questions, if you could pop them into the chat box, that would be absolutely great. And I've got an image here on the screen. You can see the chat should be on your bottom left-hand corner. You type into the white field there and just hit return, and your comments should show in the chat box for everybody. And as well, if we could use, for those of you who wish to tweet, if you tweet to hashtag 12appsDIT, and we can use that as a back channel as well. Okay. So a very warm welcome then to Professor John Traxler today, and we're absolutely thrilled to have him here as part of the 12 Apps project, so thank you, John. John is quite possibly the world's first professor of mobile learning, and he's based in the University of Wolverhampton here in the UK. So mobile learning, mobiles for education, for development, research ethics and innovation in learning are amongst his research interests, and he has numerous publications on these topics. Today his talk is entitled Spoilt for Choice, which will look at the challenges of abundance as we as educators and students face when it comes to mobile technologies. So John, I'm going to turn off my mic now and hand over to you. So if you click your talk button there under your video, we should all be able to hear you.
Okay, thanks. You should be hearing me now. Yep. Okay, thanks, Francis. And good day, good morning, good evening, happy Christmas to everyone out there. It's a pleasure to be invited to take part in this. And it's also slightly weird as well, actually, when one finds oneself sitting in front of a monitor, in front of a keyboard, imagining, or at least trying to imagine, 100 or 200 people out there. So if anyone could kind of clear their throat every now and again, or do something like that on the chat forum so that I'll know that you haven't all gone off to watch the football or gone to sleep or gone to do something on Facebook, that would be fabulous. Okay, yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited. And as the moderator just said, my title is Spoilt for Choice, which I hope is reasonably accurate, because I think that's absolutely the situation we're in. Spoilt for choice. And our concern now is actually choosing. So I'd like to focus on how that relates to various other wider concerns happening out there, actually in the wider world, not so much within the university, college and school context, but the wider world. So I'm guessing everyone's some kind of educator or in some kind of education, but in many respects I'm asking you to lose that or leave that and think about, like I say, the wider world, the wider context, and maybe come at it a bit sideways and ask some general questions. And I'm going to do that actually by hanging it on the queue from a month ago. I did a workshop in South Africa, and I was looking at how we design mobile learning, and I was addressing the fact that I think we are all doing it wrong. And in some senses, maybe we're starting from the inside working out, and maybe we ought to be starting on the outside working in. And I suppose by that I mean that we're starting as professional educators working within educational institutions, and we're hoping that we still engage with the outside world. And I worry that whether or not that's actually the case. Do we engage with the outside world? And asking whether we should be actually starting on the outside and working our way in, starting with the outside world and working our way in towards the institution. That's probably slightly opaque and pretty enigmatic, but bear it in mind. But I imagine at this workshop that the audience had turned up expecting that I was going to train them in building apps. I'd really be the last person capable of doing that, even if I thought it was a good idea. And I think this is actually a much more worthwhile idea, and probably a lot more fun as well. I should say actually that part of my introduction to that workshop was talking about how unhappy I am with the term mobile learning, and I assiduously try to say learning with mobiles, just because I think that I'm trying to kind of sidestep the baggage and the history and the expectations of the mobile learning research community, and thinking we ought to be starting afresh. And again, I think this initiative here is very much aligned to the way I'm trying to move people's thinking round a bit from where we started from to where we ought to be. Okay, so if I move to the first slide, these slides are just extracted from the middle of my workshop, and it was a fairly informal, discursive kind of workshop. We didn't have people standing up and feeding back or writing things on pieces of paper, and nor was I actually collecting the data for publication, which was a bit of an oversight on my part. I really should have done. But I was trying to explore the digital, connected kind of world, mobile world that, well, our learners, our learners live in, hopefully our teachers live in, but basically everyone else lives in, and trying to discuss how this world of mobility and connection actually transform the role of teaching and teachers. And they are fundamentally, I think, the people responsible for shaping learning experiences. I don't think it's the app designers, for example, that shape learning experiences. And I think that's part of the problem. And if I were to rephrase my earlier kind of manifesto, I would have said we need to change from shaping or constructing educational artifacts, things, to shaping educational experiences, because I think at the end of the day, that's what's needed, not more stuff, but a better understanding and exploitation of the stuff that's already out there. And as you can see on the first slide and on the subsequent 5 or 6, we were just trying to get a feel for our own world of mobility and connection. Actually getting an understanding of our learners' world of mobility and connection is really a lot more difficult, and that's still one of the challenges. As an example, I think one of our newspapers, not one of the more intellectual ones, it has to be said, but one of our newspapers in the UK recently reported survey work that said 75% of the UK population use their phone on the toilet. Well, I don't think, however hard we survey our students, they're going to start owning up to that. So in some ways, we have to really make some intelligent guesses about how the world of mobility and connection that our students live in, but then we live in that same world as well. You know, give or take some assumptions about the fact that we're all slightly older and they're all slightly younger, we can probably make a stab at guessing about the kind of world they live in. And if we try to be too systematic about trying to find out about the world they live in, well, it's probably changed by the time we've found out. So I'm really a fan of quick and dirty, because actually the world we live in is quick and dirty. Things aren't staying still long enough to find out what they are. Okay, so to return to this discussion, well, actually maybe you can guess most of the answers. Everyone does loads of everything. Steve Vosloo in South Africa made the remark even 3 or 4 years ago that most South African kids, the last thing they do is look at their mobile. The first thing they do in the morning is look at their mobile. You know, and so you can guess the rest. You know, everyone keeps it fairly nearby, daytime and nighttime, you know, and so on and so on. It's just as ubiquitous as we are being told. And it's also as varied as you might imagine. You know, people behave differently. So that actually means that it's a really big envelope in which we're trying to shape our learners' learning experiences. They are not homogeneous, stable, systematic, and neither is the world that we all live in. And so in thinking of, you know, what we can do in terms of designing educational experiences, that's what we're trying to design ourselves into. And if you look at the second slide, the one that says living, conversing, queuing, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, again, everyone does loads of everything. They do it whilst they're commuting. And again, like using the mobile on the toilet, they won't actually tell you they use the mobile whilst they're driving. But as a cyclist, I can vouch for the fact that probably 50% of them are using it whilst they're driving. Do they use it in lectures? Yeah, not only the students, but sometimes the lecturers as well. And in restaurants, cafes, concerts, seminars, buses, the lot. So the world we anticipate constructing learning for is really messy. And again, the answer to these questions, do you use your devices for work or study or recreation, one device or different devices for those various things? Well, it turns out everyone's got very mixed preferences. I mean, some people like me keep their work Kindle separate from their recreation Kindle. Other people don't. Some people have got an option for the kind of generic device that does everything. Some people will keep an iPod and a Kindle and so on for different kinds of activities, different formats, different media. Some people I know will assiduously only answer their email twice a day. Other people will turn it round within seconds. And on to the next one. Again, living with your mobile. Yeah, well, the people at my workshop didn't necessarily see it in these terms. You know, were they connecting, producing, consuming, storing? But nevertheless, they were doing all of those things, but to a greater or lesser extent, and everyone was different. And what they were doing it with was all of those things: images, movies, and so on. And you can argue that maybe a lot of that, at least a significant part of that, was shaped by objective factors like infrastructure and tariffs. I mean, clearly you can use an iPod or a podcast when you're offline or when connectivity is expensive, but in metropolitan areas that might not be an issue at all. And it might be something to do with the kind of rhythm of your life when you prefer to be listening to podcasts or engaging in email. And certainly some of the literature that uses the phrase phone space to distinguish what we do on phones from what we do with computers, you know, the difference between phone space and cyberspace, very much makes the point that cyberspace is a kind of fairly stable environment. And by comparison, phone space is very lightweight, opportunistic. We're into bits of it, we're into other bits of it. Stuff provokes us, we change the app, we change the functionality, we do something different. And one of the consequences, I suppose, of that is that any of the literature that talks about digital residents and digital visitors is potentially quite inappropriate. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with David White and Alison McCornew's work derived from empirical data about how our students are working with digital technology, but that comes up with what seems to be a fairly stable continuum between those that are visitors within cyberspace, visitors to cyberspace, and those that are resident there. That makes a fairly clear-cut spectrum that maybe people move along, but nevertheless, the image they use, actually, the metaphor maybe they use for residents and visitors is a garden shed. The visitors go in there to find a tool, and they find it and they leave as quickly as possible. The residents kind of live in that shed. Well, I don't think phone space is a shed. I haven't yet really come up with a kind of transient, messy metaphor to replace the shed with, but it isn't a shed. The boundaries and the solidity are a lot vaguer and more transient. And this is the world that we're trying to design or construct or take the responsibility for the learning experiences of our learners. And to move on, attempting to find a kind of taxonomy, classification for what people are doing with their mobiles. You can try and break it down in this way as well. And again, the people in the workshop did all of these various things. They didn't necessarily categorize it in this way, and they didn't necessarily recognize it in these ways. But they were certainly in amongst all of these different activities, all these different technologies, connectivities, in a way that is really hard to pin down for us to work with. Okay, so that, in a sense, for this workshop was one section where we were looking at what's the kind of world that we, the people, the educators present at the workshop, inhabited. We had a discussion about what kind of world, digital, connected, mobile world, might our learners be living in, and that's a lot more problematic. We don't have the technology currently to easily monitor what they're doing. I mean, especially as computers are a clearly part of a, what do you call it, separable part of our activities. We're either sitting at a computer or we're not. Mobiles aren't like that. They're with us everywhere. Asking what a life without mobiles is like is beginning to get like asking what a world without shoes is like. We have trouble imagining or remembering it. I suppose, sorry, as a digression, I'd argue that in the UK we use the expression technology-enhanced learning, and we really shouldn't. There's not much learning left that isn't technology-enhanced. Maybe we ought to be looking at some parts of learning and saying it's technology impoverished. And I think you can look at the outside world in much the same way. There's not much of the outside world of our day-to-day lives. And I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa as much as I'm talking about northwestern Europe. Most of our worlds are digitally enabled, mobile enabled. But actually finding out the detail, getting down to the specifics of our students is a lot harder. We can't easily monitor all of their traffic, all of their locations, even if there weren't kind of profound ethical problems in the way of doing that. And they're not even necessarily conscious of what they're doing on their mobiles in the way that they might be with their computers, just because it's so, I don't know, what you call it, compiled, to use a psychological term. It's like changing gear in a car. You don't even notice you've done it. So I think there are profound difficulties about understanding the digital and mobile world our students live in. But actually we haven't got any choice but to get on with making the best, quickest, dirtiest attempt to understand it and to address it before it changes. Well, it already has, of course. So, okay, we then talked about how did the people in this workshop learn things. And I was very clear that I wanted to avoid ambitions or aspirations or objectives where they might just resort to formal learning. You know, I'll just enroll on a course. And was at pains, therefore, to ask them to talk about stuff that you might call informal learning, stuff that you might call andragogy, or in fact stuff that you might call hertagogy, you know, where there wasn't necessarily a teacher, where there wasn't a relationship with a teacher, where there might be a community out there, but actually, how did you go about these various things? The range of things I chose was learning a new language, and I chose Arabic and Swahili just because they are kind of wildly unfamiliar to most of the people in my workshop, or Indian and Chinese cookery, or understanding the outbreak of World War I, or kayaking or surfing, or tracing their ancestors, or understanding and becoming competent at the transactions and procedures of buying or selling a house, the legal transactions and procedures of buying or selling a house in their history, or writing some kind of neighbourhood history. And I suppose basically I chose some activities or objectives that were not by and large the subject of university courses, but actually as soon as you look outside the university and the colleges and the schools, there's a lot of it going on. There's a lot of people tracing their ancestors. There's a lot of people writing local histories, arguing about things like the outbreak of the First World War or the Second World War or any other number of wars, current and historical. Yeah, I was interested in finding out exactly what they did, how they went about these kinds of things. And as it turned out, I almost hit lucky that many of the people in the workshop, and there were maybe 50 of them, had tried a few of these things and were learning these things and actually could report back. And I'm not sure if any of this is going to come as a surprise. I mean, again, the general feedback was, it's a mess, there's loads of ways of doing it, everyone's doing it differently. And you could almost argue that what we were looking at might be called their own learning style. You know, people have their own learning style, not in the way that we used to talk about it, you know, are they visual learners, but in a new way of talking about it. What's maybe the personal learning environment that they construct around themselves on a kind of opportunistic way to find out about stuff and to share about it and talk about it. Yeah, so what were the answers? Well, actually, and unsurprisingly, a lot of them went to YouTube for any of these things, actually. So although some of them, like buying a house, are quite textual, you know, they're not about images or movies or sound, they're actually just pure text. Nevertheless, there's stuff already out there on YouTube about buying houses or researching local history. Some of them posted mail-based queries, so I'm not quite sure what the alternative phrase for mail-based is, listserv maybe, you know, but they join a group that's specifically running a mail base on local history, and they start posting questions. And some of them joined communities of some sort or another, special interest groups, that they find something on Facebook, a group devoted to ornithology, wildflowers, you know, whatever it is. And in some of those, you find actually people have started them to just impart their own knowledge. So it's not just a community, but maybe it's become a community around a particular set of instructional tools and assets. Others found apps, and that's certainly what I've done in trying to teach myself Arabic and Chinese, however badly I've managed it. Some looked for MOOCs, but then we know what the attrition rate on a MOOC is, 12%, 20%, survive, you know, beyond the first few episodes. And then others use Google, but of course we know, again, the history with Google is that maybe people reach the bottom of the first page and don't often get down to the second page. You know, so there's a lot goes on here beyond just kind of rational behaviour. However rational or irrational, it's all different, and people have lots and lots of different ways of approaching these kinds of problems. And they're working usually without anyone with any kind of formal status as an educator. I mean, you could almost argue it's a kind of rather messier version of the original Canadian pedagogy built that underpins MOOCs. You know, it's about communities teaching each other and allowing massive online connection to enable them to connect with, if you like, knowledgeable others. You know, so if we backpedal a second and say, okay, what is it these people did use? Well, it's the abundance I'm talking about, and it's the problem of choice that I was addressing. So yeah, they're using apps, they're using webcasts, they're using videos, they're using podcasts, they join groups, they join lists, and so on, and so on, and so on. Right, and I'm advancing the slide, sorry, that's it, did it. And this is certainly a big challenge for educators. You know, if we are to stay, if you like, credible or aligned to how our learners, our students, our potential learners, our potential students operate in the outside world, then we've got to recognise this is how it's happening. So there are lots of new challenges, but there is a fairly obvious observation actually about the transition in our role as teachers, as people responsible for the educational experience, that we shouldn't really be thinking about creating stuff. We shouldn't be creating communities locked inside of VLE, and we shouldn't be creating content. There's lots of content out there, there's lots of communities out there, and actually the agenda maybe for teachers and for educators and lecturers becomes, how is it we help people choose? And that's why I'm so happy to be involved in this initiative, because it's actually about choice, it's about judgment, it's about making decisions. It's not about adding one more website to a world that seems to be completely full of them anyway, or of creating an app that might sync without a trace, but it's actually looking for those that haven't and asking what's good about them and what can they do for us, and actually how can they be appropriated. I mean, if you look at Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Flickr, and so many other applications and sites, they weren't created for educational usage. Well, not all the apps mostly, certainly not originally, but we need to appropriate them, figure out what's good, what can we use them for. And bear in mind the kind of corollary to that, if you like, is when our students graduate, what's the first bit of technology they'll drop? What's the first thing they'll stop using? I suspect it's going to be their VLE, followed by their e-portfolio. Will they stop using Facebook the day they graduate? Will they stop going onto iTunes? I don't think so. So if you're looking at this from a kind of lifelong learning agenda, then very much we should be looking at how can we evaluate, recommend, share the apps that are out there as the underlying, I don't know, critical and cognitive skill that our students use. So we've got to move, I suppose I'm arguing, from creating to curating. Another synonym for curating at one time was orchestrating. You know, that we're trying to, we've got the instruments in front of us that might create the learner experience, but we actually need to orchestrate or conduct, as a wealth of metaphors waiting to be abused. But to go on to this last slide, yeah, there's the issue of what is it that people are, what are the resources that people are using, you know, webinars, videos, whatever, and what's the basis for their choice? And these were the things in casting around amongst the people at the workshop we came up with. So there is, in the middle, authority. You know, this is a university, I'm a lecturer, believe what I say. or it's on the syllabus, or it's in the exam. But a lot of other things that work as well. And I guess if you put apps in the wider context of, for example, the markets or the sort of iTunes ecosystem, then we're also looking at recommendations and ratings, the kind of things you find in TripAdvisor or Amazon. So there's not only the apps and the choosing of the apps, but actually also as an educational skill, both for us as educators and our learners. There's the business of, could you write a recommendation? What would you be saying? How would you read it? Would you trust it? How would you find out if you trusted it? Sorry, I've used the word trust about 3 times, and that's, you know, something at work as well. You might trust lecturers, you might trust your peer group, your family, your friends, your work colleagues. All of these might be having some input into the basis for choosing your apps. But certainly something that starts off looking authoritative but becomes a community, such as these 12 apps, is very much going in the right direction. And then, of course, maybe what develops out of that is some of the others on that list, loyalty and habit. I guess it's such a complex world that the easiest way to do a lot of things is the way you did them last time. And unless people and things undermine your trust or challenge your habits, actually, there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with good habits. It cuts down the overheads. Yeah, so these were the kinds of things we looked at as a way of establishing how do we make choices about apps and about all of the other stuff that our learners could be using. So we need to be building judgment, and we need to be building critical judgment, but we also need to be recognizing, I suppose, when I was saying this was part of for me, a larger agenda. I think one of the problems with mobile learning, as it was kind of constituted in 2001, 2002, was it was kind of predicated on the idea that we would give the learners devices. And even before the world economic collapse of 2008, that was probably a really bad idea. It just made mobile learning look like another way of spending money. But certainly it's no way is that possible now. And what we've seen over the last 3, 4, 5 years maybe is the idea of BYOD, bring your own device. And that may appeal to institutions like universities and colleges as a way of tackling a financial problem, but actually learning with mobiles is not financially sustainable if the state or the university is going to pay for the hardware or the connectivity, but it suddenly becomes sustainable if we think, no, we won't supply it, the learners will, and bring your own device then becomes the headline upon which mobile learning suddenly becomes scalable and sustainable. But of course, it's the thin end of the wedge, and certainly in looking at bring your own device policies, at the moment they are patchy and they're a bit thin on detail. You know, what would it actually mean to a learner to find out that they could bring their own device? You know, what's the nature of the support? What's the nature of the recommendation? What exactly is being provided? What's the deal? You know, so the nature of the policy I find in the UK is patchy and problematic. And institutions are coming up with various, if you like, tactical issues. Ooh, there's a staff development problem, or we haven't got the infrastructure. But behind that, there's a rather different problem that is not being articulated quite so clearly, and that's the issues of agency and control. Learners won't just bring their own devices into the lecture theatre, into the classroom. They'll, of course, be bringing their own services, their own technology, their own connectivity. The control of what goes on with that technology will move, the centre of gravity will move from being entirely under the control of the lecturer, when it was students accessing the university VLE on the university desktop computers via the university's connectivity. It will move from that scenario to the learners accessing whatever they like on their own devices through the connectivity that they're paying for, and suddenly they get to make the choices, and they're the ones potentially wresting control of what goes on from the lecturer. So this is quite problematic, maybe in terms of lecturer identity. So you know, I'm now supposed to be no longer the sage on the stage, but some kind of guide by the side. But actually, I'm a guide by the side, faced with a bewildering variety of technologies, handsets, material, and it's running away with me. It's out of control. You know, things are a lot more stable in a world where I just put stuff in the VLE and students work their way through it. You know, so I don't think we're anywhere near addressing those kinds of issues, but clearly apps feature in that world where students bring their own devices, because on those devices are all of their stuff. The apps you may or may not have recommended, the apps that their friends, their colleagues, their parents may have recommended, who knows? You know, and certainly we haven't figured out how to live with this scenario, especially as it keeps so rapidly changing. But when we talk about recommending apps, the financial scenario around sustainability probably means we're recommending apps that they're going to put on their phone, not on one that we're going to provide them with. And if you look at tablets, maybe they're at a kind of cusp, I suppose, where tablets are expensive. For reasons of equity, we're unlikely to be giving tablets to all of our students because we can't afford it, and we're unlikely to be coercing our students to get tablets because they can't afford it. So in some situations, for example, medical schools, we might find that the university has been giving students tablets, and that's a kind of extension of the old regime. You know, where we can give them the tablet and we can lock it down and we can install just what we want installed. But other medical schools have taken a more, I don't know, open-ended approach and given the students a tablet and let them do what they like with it. So the apps that get installed, not necessarily recommended or coerced by the institution. But the advantage is clearly that students take ownership. It becomes theirs. They customize it. It suits them. But as soon as we move from tablets to anything smaller, you know, large format phones, dumb phones, phones that run one operating systems, or phones that run a different operating system, it's much more complex. So okay, we're going to see the advance of bring your own device scenarios, and at the same time we're trying to create a learning environment in which all sorts of external resources have a place. But that external environment is going to be built on a variety of platforms, and this whole the skill set that we need to make that work is problematic. So that's not necessarily a particularly encouraging answer, but neither is pretending that it's still 1995. So I'll wind up in a second, but I'm hoping that what I've constructed was a kind of coherent, if you like, worldview in which, well, 12 apps for Christmas play their part. And I certainly think that this kind of initiative should form an increasingly valuable part of the education skill set. Yeah, so basically I'm saying that I think the 12 apps for Christmas, I'd say not only Christmas, of course, but Diwali, Eid, and the summer solstice, you know, would be a brilliant idea. And it's a very useful way of developing the skills that we need to find and evaluate and share resources, because I think we can leave it to other people to build them and sell them. But actually we need to be exploiting that abundance and helping everyone make their choices. So I think we've got maybe about 20 minutes. I welcome any kind of reaction at all. I'm conscious, you know, when one rushes through these kinds of discussions, there's a risk of overgeneralizing, of there being sweeping generalizations. But, you know, and so therefore when you get down to the detail of I don't know, your students, your infrastructure, your environment, your curriculum, it pans out possibly quite differently. But I suppose I'm pointing up the pressures on the education sector to recognise how the outside world is moving on, and what are the challenges out there that we need to recognise and address. Okay, I hope that made some sense. I'll turn off my
John, thanks a million for that. There's been a lot of activity in the chat box. One in particular, one comment that really stood out for me in the chat box was the fact that we're all so overwhelmed by, you know, the amount of technologies that we have and of what we're using, you know, simultaneously. And one of the participants stated, "How do we tackle overwhelm?" And our filter is the answer, but what do those filters look like? Have you any comments on that? Any ideas?
No, I mean, I suppose, well, some ideas. I mean, I suppose it's quite easy for me to be revolutionary, and it's quite good fun as well. But we have to recognise that the many of the forces at work on the education sector are quite conservative. You know, employers, trades unions, educational managers, politicians, for various reasons, they would like to, quality assurance structures, personnel agencies as well, you know, they would like things to stay the same, quite possibly, or they would like to stay the way they were when they went through education. You know, and so change is not going to happen overnight. We're not going to be overwhelmed by abundance overnight. Like it or not, the forces of conservatism will hold us back. And so maybe there is a job to be done just kind of explaining to them actually what's going on, what the outside world looks like, why this is significant. So that might actually mean that whilst we recognise it, if we look in one direction, we see chaos and bewilderment. On the other hand, the forces of conservatism, if you like, the forces that kind of keep the system stable and keep the system doing its job, aren't going to let us change in quite such a radical and dramatic and revolutionary kind of way. And I guess we'll do what we can do, if you see what I mean. That actually all of us in our different ways are parts of these systems, are parts of these communities, have got our ears and eyes open. So in that sense, maybe I'm expecting radical change to happen in an organic fashion. That's a slight paradox, but I'm actually quite hopeful that it just needs people to listen, you know, and talk. Sorry, that's hardly a blindingly intellectual answer.
No bother. I know we said we wouldn't let participants necessarily use the mic, but seeing as we do have a few minutes, if there is a comment or a question you'd like to put to John, you'll see at the top of the chat box there is a little icon that has a hand, okay? And if you click that, it raises your hand, and then I can call on individual names. When I call in your name, you can click the talk button under John's video there, and that will hand the mic over to you. So if there is anyone who would like to say something, just raise your hand. Everyone's gone very quiet now, and the chat box is really busy. Just one other thing that struck while we're waiting for somebody to claim the mic there. One other thing that struck me is actually so that technology enhanced learning really isn't a term that, really isn't really appropriate anymore, and that learning is, there's not much learning left that isn't technology enhanced anymore. Maybe outside of the classroom, but I'm thinking maybe inside the classrooms. It's a lot of, it's definitely not technology enhanced in many classrooms. Okay, I've got a couple of people there. Robert, we start with you. So if you want to click the talk button, Robert, and put your question to John. Robert Hickey, do you want to click the talk button? Okay, Robert, I can see your mic is on, but I'm not hearing anything. You're in the chat box now. Chris, we move on to you. Do you want to take the talk button there?
I could answer one of the questions, or maybe rephrase it. I happen to notice. Sorry, at my age, I really struggle to read anything below about kind of 20 points. And that was the remark about teachers and maybe teacher education. I think that's a particularly interesting challenge because clearly we need to change schools. We need schools to be aligned to the outside world and society and the world of employment and all the rest of it. And that implies changing teachers. And so but it also implies changing the structure and the curriculum and what goes on in schools whilst the outside world keeps moving on. And so it's like a kind of Russian doll of things that need changing. We need to change teacher education just in the way that we've been describing, just because we need to change higher education in order to enable new teachers to change the education system and the school system that they go into. But that implies not only do they need to have the technical and the pedagogic skill set, but to know something about the management of change. So I think they've got a really tough job on, because they not only have to change how they learn and change how they teach, but know how to transmit and transform the institutions, the schools into which they go as teachers. But actually to recognise that the school sector has a largely different set of constraints. I'm thinking about the duty of care and the fact that school students are legally minors, for example, and that the classroom and the curriculum are constructed in different ways. So I think, I'm just piling problem on top of problem, but clearly the way to break into the system is, if you like, teacher education, because that will change the kids that come out of school into higher education. But teacher education, certainly in the UK, is struggling in resources. So that, again, it's not easy.
Simon had his hand up to speak there. Simon, are you still there, and does your talk button work? Do you want to click on talk and take over the mic?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, good. No, what I really wanted to talk about was the focus of your talk, John, has been about the teacher learner discussion. There's another discussion that goes on, which is the teacher institution discussion, and that seems to be lagging very far behind in terms of applications and mobile technology and all the rest of it, and that the burden of administration doesn't seem to be in any way eased by all of these new advances in technology. Do you have a view on that?
Oh, sure, yeah. I think that's a very valuable point. What I was saying partly early on in looking at my workshop in Pretoria and asking people how they learnt wasn't about asking about their relationships with teachers. It was just asking about how they learnt. But yet, so So there is a growing, if you like, opportunity and technology for hertagogy where people can learn amongst themselves, where they can become their own teachers, or where their communities can work as teachers and learners collaborating with each other. But yeah, you make an important point about the role of the institutions, and I think that's part of my concern about, sorry, how can I do this, quote unquote, mobile learning. You know, from the first decade of this century, it was conceptualized and understood as an improvement on e-learning with computers. You know, it grew out of that community, the e-learning community. It had the same, if you like, rhetoric about innovation. It had the same kind of way of tackling problems and conceptualizing, well, it was the same paradigm, if you want to put it in that term. You can wrap it up as mobile learning was part of the e-learning paradigm. It was a little bit stuck on the corner. You know, and therefore the way that we developed it, the way that we controlled it, the way we procured it, the way that change and progress and innovation happened, were all conceptualized within that envelope of e-learning. And I suppose that's my concern, that in that concept, within that way of conceptualizing it, we then just spent 15 years barking up the wrong tree, because I suppose we proved that if you worked with mobile devices in the way that you worked with desktop institutional computers, then it took you down a road which ended up with increased expenditure and more responsibilities and more stuff to control. And so I'm arguing for not a change within the institution coming from the top down, you know, as an innovation or a project or an initiative that starts with the kind of clever specialist at the top and eventually reaches the chalk face with subject teachers at the bottom, but actually starts at the outside in, you know, which says, let's look out of the window and see what people on the street are doing. Oh, they all seem to be holding mobile devices. And I think that's a sustainable way of looking at things, because it straight away buys into the bring your own device scenario and financial sustainability. And it also buys into, you know, employability and digital literacy and those kinds of concerns as well. But I think, yes, you're right, the relationship between the teachers and the institutions and the various support services within the institutions and the regulatory environment within the institutions is quite a problem. And I almost hope that what mobile learning, you know, the research community around mobile learning has achieved is kind of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. That actually none of our projects have proved very much. But they have actually allowed people to handle mobile devices and get used to them, and we actually see them in the classroom, even if they're actually doing something that's not sustainable and doesn't really relate to the world our students live in. But yeah, it's a big deal, a big challenge for our institution. And one can only hope in some way that there's a kind of generational change, you know, that people will retire and move on, and 15 years' time or 20 years' time, it will be natural.
Is there anybody else who'd like to put the last question to John? Because I'm conscious of time, and he's been so generous with his time. I'm not going to make him stay longer than the hour. So we have 5 minutes. Is there any last questions for John there? Interesting comment in the chat box there. Technology change is breakneck at present, but generational change is a lot slower. That's an interesting way of putting it, Neil. Yeah, good man.
Yes, I can't remember how that as a phrase or a maxim or an aphorism that relates to the way technology rushes up on us. You know, how social change maybe is much slower but more significant, and technological change is really quite quick and trivial.
So the comments there in the chat box about banning technology in the classroom. And there are still a lot of educators that do ban technology in the classroom. Maybe it's just the fear of what it will be used for. you know, instead they won't be listening and so on. I think there needs to be getting people to think differently about use of technology in the classroom, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a kind of proxy or a Trojan horse for a much more complex argument. You know, because on the one hand, you know, if you take the example of the calculator, you know, or the biro, and people were saying, oh, you know, it's the end of civilization, or it's the end of literacy, or actually in the case of social media, they're saying it's the end of meaningful social relationships and all the rest of it. But the problem seems to be separating what is significant and meaningful and durable. So maybe the ability to communicate our ideas, the ability to construct our ideas is important, and actually the medium and the technology with which we do it, or even the grammar with which we do it, is less significant. But I'm not sure at what point, somewhere in the middle, you draw the line and say, you know, this is culturally significant, we are still exchanging great ideas, and the point at which we say this is merely trivializing everything and turning it into a kind of consumerist bite-sized transaction. But hopefully that argument will run and run.
Okay, it's just coming up to 2 o'clock. I think that's a good point in which to end and to wrap up the session. Again, thank you so much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us and be part of the 12 apps this year. And people have been coming in and out of the room. People had lectures and things to go to. So there's been people way back in the chat saying thanks, got to go, great session, great food for thought, and so on. So it's been absolutely great. Thank you. The session, as I said, has been recorded. I'll end the recording now in a moment. And once that has it takes you know, 8 or 9 hours or so to get it from Blackboard, and I'll try and convert it a minute before and make it available on the 12 Apps website. Loads of thank yous coming in there.
Sorry, I'm going to have to read the chat afterwards because it just whizzes past too fast, especially for someone with my eyesight. Yeah, but it has been a great opportunity, and it's actually a great opportunity to kind of think things through, put them into words, and hear what people think. So, thanks, and well, happy Christmas, I guess, and many more. Cheers.
Thanks, John. That's my first happy Christmas, so there you go.